Okay, shall we begin, everyone? Fantastic. Um, Hello and welcome to welcome again to IGF 2024. This is the last day zero event on Workshop Room One. The title of the event is Addressing Information Manipulation in Southeast Asia. My name is Baltazar Krisatia, or Baltazar, from the Jakarta-based Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, in Indonesia, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon session. Um, Joining with me are the speakers, Peter Alexander Pandi, my colleague, researcher from CSIS Indonesia as well, and also Dr. Dick Chan, postdoctoral fellow, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. And also joining us online is Maria Mendoza, assistant professor, Department of Political Science, University of Philippines, as well as Dr. Fitriani, senior analyst at Australia Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI. Okay. Before we begin our session, kindly allow me to provide a little bit of context about who we are as the organizers, uh, and also why do we pick this topic to be presented amongst other ongoing research projects that we are also presenting, that we are also conducting in Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific in general. So, Meet Saver Internet Lab. It is a research program that were co-constructed, if you will, or co-concepted by CSIS, our home institution, in partnership with Google, Google Indonesia back then, and followed by Google Asia Pacific later on. It is a research hub that convenes all researchers and also practitioners working on information ecosystem. So on the first year, we are trying to capture the whole supply chain, if you will, of this information. So we conducted some kind of anthropological research to disinformation actors. We try to cover how buzzers or cyber troopers and bots conducted the influence operation campaign in Indonesia. We also conduct a user-centered research by conducting a surveys on public susceptibility on disinformations to promote the balance between digital information and political literacy. And we also conducted a platform-facing research on, we want to explore further on what are the co-governance models that are acceptable and yet better responses and mitigations and can bring along the government actors, tech platform, as well as civil society in one forum and in one institution. And so we've been doing this for the second year in a row now. We've concurrent with the 2024 general elections that were conducted in Indonesia. And so we collaborate a lot with information actors as well as electoral actors in Indonesia. We also shape the dialogue with international communities in which we join as speakers and also participated in the UNESCO forum, UN forum, and also several diplomatic embassies. We've also hosted academic conference on disinformation in Indonesia, as well as publishing op-eds, reports in which you can find the report, the printed version of the report in our booth just outside of this room. We've established like a booth for the entire IGF 2024, so feel free to drop in anytime. And for this year, 2024, going forward, we will be focusing on three research. The first is on the impact of deepfakes on online fraud, how generative AI would worsen the topography of online scams in Southeast Asia. We also take a closer look into the impact of disinformation to democratic resilience. How is the net sum of democracy after a series of electoral tsunami, if you will, in 2024, and where does the information resilience plays a part in this? And lastly, the one that we are going to present on this occasion is on information manipulation and interference. We are also a part of the Global Network of Internet and Society Research Center, or Global Network of Centers, in which institutions such as Harvard University, Oxford Internet Institute, the CIS at Stanford, and other probably 100 to 200 institutions focusing on Internet society convene in an academic discussion globally. So that's a short presentation on SAIL. but we will delve further into a topic, into one topic that is probably in growing interest across the region, which is on the information manipulation. We have an Indonesian case study, a Vietnamese case study, Philippines case study, and some perspective from Australia. Uh, Without further ado, I will let Peter, 10 to 15 minutes, to present the case on foreign information manipulation and interference, and whether what is happening in this part of the world, which is Southeast Asia, whether there are some parallels that can be drawn to instances that are also happening elsewhere. So please, Peter, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Belts. Again, thank you everyone for attending this session. My name is Peter Pandy, researcher at the Safer Internet Lab and also researcher at the Department of International Relations at CSIS Indonesia. So as Belts has very well introduced, the Safer Internet Lab this year has 3 research streams that we've tried to conduct for the second year of research of this research lab. And I will be focusing mostly on the foreign information manipulation and interference and instances of that occurring in Southeast Asia. And I'll also be covering a little bit about how the information landscape in Indonesia specifically, and how that correlates between foreign-based disinformation or domestic-sourced disinformation. So as part of the research stream for FEMI in SAIL this year, we've tried to create a database that's tried to make records of FEMI instances in Southeast Asia from 2019 to 2024. So what we've done is from open source sources, we've tried to make a database of cases of where information operations, whether traditional, digital, or offline, have been made in Southeast Asia from 2019 to 2024. And for the data set, we've tried to make those 3 categories. So for traditional media influence, examples include when influence actors place advertisements, hires or pays or influences a journalist or an opinion leader to share their part of the story on media, and so on and so forth. And for digital media influence, these would be cases such as coordinated inauthentic behaviors, creation of troll and bot networks to share narratives on digital media, and offline influence include diplomatic influence, economic investment, and so on and so forth. But for part of this research, we'll be focusing mostly on the digital aspect of it. So part of the ongoing research, what we found so far as part of our data set is that while disinformation has been discussed openly by countries in Southeast Asia, FEMI has not been discussed that much across Southeast Asian states. And we'll delve into the reasons why later. But for disinformation specifically, what we found is that countries in Southeast Asia tend to focus more on disinformation as the topic, but not FEMI. So what they've tried to address by policy is disinformation that's occurred domestically, but not much discussion of FEMI more broadly. So as part of our data set, we've discovered that through our early findings is that so far the data set shows a tale of 2 halves between 2019 and 2024. So from 2019 to 2021, we found that cases of FEMI were not quite high. Most of the disinformation cases that occurred in Southeast Asian states were domestically sourced, that were attributed, so they were mostly domestic, created by local actors or sometimes government actors. But from 2022 to 2024, what we found is that there has been an increase of reported FEMI cases, and also a greater diversity of threat actors that have been operating in Southeast Asia's information landscape. So the correlation that we've sort of made as a result of these data findings is that there has been an increase of FEMI and influence operations in Southeast Asia concurrent with rising geopolitical tensions between great powers, and also rising number of international conflicts. So the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. These have in fact increased the number of influence and FEMI operations in Southeast Asia, whereas from 2019 to 2021, it was still mostly domestic focused. So in addressing disinformation, as I've covered before, most countries still use national approaches to legislation, rarely through attribution. So very few countries, if any, attribute where the sources of disinformation are if they're foreign. If they're domestic, it's more likely the case that it would occur. And even more rarely through retaliation. I don't think we have a case of that we found so far. So as part of our data set, we've recorded from 10 different countries in Southeast Asia, and drawing on lessons from Taiwan and Australia as well. And what we found is that it was quite difficult to find cases of because our team is quite small and we're mostly English speaking. So the most of our sources were English speaking media and newspapers and so on and so forth. And we found that that was a great limitation in how we identified cases, particularly in countries where the information space is very much smaller and much less exposed to English language media. So countries such as Cambodia and Laos, we found that it was quite difficult to identify cases of foreign-based disinformation. Number one is because attribution rarely occurred, where they attributed a foreign actor as part of the disinformation operation. And number two is that if it were to occur, it would most likely be in the local language. So the language would be localized. Whereas in countries where the information landscape and the social media users were much more exposed to international media, it was a lot easier to detect cases of FEMI operations. And moving forward, we also identified a few foreign influence actors. These actors include, from reported cases, these are actors such as China, Russia, Iran, and also some non-state actors that were unattributed, either whether they were supported by a state actor or not. Mm-hmm. And also one of the examples that we found was also the United States, in fact, engaging in some information operations in Southeast Asia. So to wrap up how the data set that we found is that sources of disinformation and the information landscape more broadly in Southeast Asia is very different and very contextual from different Southeast Asian states, especially during election periods and so on and so forth. There's also very different threat perceptions, particularly relating to FEMI. While disinformation is considered a challenge and is likely so for many states even outside of Southeast Asia, not all governments consider FEMI as a current threat. Some are quite comfortable with leaving certain cases of FEMI to fester because it's not deemed as a big threat to the existing political regime, or it's not creating the social disturbances that other sources of domestic disinformation might. There's also, I think, with the different cyber capabilities across Southeast Asian states, there's also a difficulty in addressing these issues or even attributing the source of disinformation. So in Southeast Asia, while there is, in ASEAN, for example, while there is the cybersecurity cooperation agreements and so on and so forth, these are still mostly led or hosted by countries such as Singapore or Malaysia, who have higher, I would say, cyber capabilities compared to other Southeast Asian states who are still building on those capabilities. So not everyone is on the same page, either threat perception-wise or capabilities-wise. And moving on specifically to Indonesia, we just held elections in 2024, presidential elections, and while the data is still very fresh, very new, because the election just occurred in February of this year, we found that most of the disinformation cases were still domestic sourced, so either by non-state actors that were paid by government actors or certain political actors, but still very domestic based. And as part of that, we found that there were differences in how disinformation was created in previous elections. So in 2016 or 2019 presidential and regional elections, the game in 2024 was a lot different. Whereas in previous elections prior to 2020, most of the disinformation that was created was very text-based and image-based and distributed on platforms that were text-based and image-based. So platforms such as Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, but they were either image or just text-based disinformation, or on messaging apps like WhatsApp. Whereas in 2024, we saw a greater proliferation of disinformation incidents that involved Gen AI, either visual or audio form. So three of the examples that I've noted down here is, the first is a video-based deepfake of our former president who has passed away, who stated support for one of the political candidates. So that was a deepfake that was made. He was making a speech saying that we should support this certain candidate. Two other examples that was published, that was posted on TikTok, was audio-based. So one of them was an argument that occurred between a certain political candidate and the head of a party that supported him, which was very convincing for a lot of people. And the third one was one of the presidential candidates giving a speech in fluent Arabic when he did not, in fact, speak fluent Arabic. So these are three different ways where Gen AI has affected how disinformation has proliferated in Indonesia. And one thing that we found is that our election bodies that are trying to deal with these disinformation cases are still playing on the playbook from 2019 and previous elections. They were not adequately prepared to deal with how disinformation would be proliferated in future elections because of the creation of Gen AI. And I think this is another problem that will continue moving forward. So to wrap up the presentation, what's the way forward after this? So I've identified three things. Number one is I think that, especially this is for an Indonesian context, of course I can't speak for every country since everyone has a very, very different contextual information landscape, but I think for Indonesia specifically, a multi-stakeholder approach involving government, civil society, and social media platforms will be needed to comprehensively address disinformation, either during elections or other instances. Obviously, with Gen AI developing the way it is, it will be very, very difficult to create policy that will form itself as guardrails for it, since, with increasing geopolitical tensions and the tech competition between great powers, I think we're going to see the rapid development of Gen AI. So I think we need to do what we can and involve as much stakeholders as possible in that regard. Number two, I think, as I said before, emerging technologies will intensify the speed, nature, and spread of disinformation. While I think now there are still cases of Gen AI with video and audio that is still a little bit easy to identify where it's fake or not, I think moving forward, the capabilities of these technologies will improve, where it'll be increasingly difficult, even for the trained eye, to detect whether that's disinformation or not. And lastly, and I think this is very important to say, especially for the Indonesian context, is that we need to strike a balance between effective governance of the information landscape and ensuring that democratic freedoms for civilians are still upheld. Because this is drawing from previous research at the Safer Internet Lab, is that while there are policy responses from the government to address this information, oftentimes they can step into civil freedoms for expressing opinions and so on and so forth. So they don't address this information, but they limit freedoms for expression and so on. So I think that balance is, of course, very, very difficult to strike, but I think it's something that we need to note on moving forward. And I think that will be it for my presentation. I'll pass it back to Belts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Before we move on with Dr. Fitri, allow me to delve further into something that you just said. Please paint a further picture on the users. You've explained really well on how threat perceptions inhibits the effort against information manipulation. You've also painted a picture on different topography of threats in Southeast Asia, but how does the receiving end looks like? How does the users looks like? Is this the Indonesian users serves as a fertile ground for disinformation, if you will, or because they have been the quote unquote victim for disinformation by domestic actors, and does it make them a fertile ground for foreign interference, in your opinion?
Right. So I think with disinformation, and this can be extrapolated to not just Indonesians, but people from other countries as well, is that disinformation is most effective when it reinforces certain opinions or ideas that someone already has. This is something that I've spoken about with counterparts from the U.S. and Australia, as well as that even foreign, whether foreign or domestic, the confirmation bias is a very, very big thing in how disinformation is spread. So when you already have pre-existing notions of a certain idea or a certain political position, that disinformation can reinforce those ideas and in fact make it stronger. And I think in the Indonesian context more specifically, we are one of the most populated countries in the world. I think number 4 right now. Digitalization is occurring rapidly, and a lot of the youth are starting to become more and more exposed to social media. And I think while that increase has happened, digital literacy has not increased with it. And I think that's another challenge that we need to take, is that improving digital literacy for social media users, whether young or old in Indonesia, to be able to differentiate between fact and fiction, real or hoax information, I think is another really important step forward. I think this is also part of a public opinion survey that SAIL has conducted last year, and the numbers were quite low for the amount of people who have participated in a digital literacy program that was held by the government. Even though these programs existed for public, not a lot of people were aware of them, and even less people were involved in them. So I think this is another challenge moving forward.
Thank you. Moving on to Dr. Fitriani, Senior Analyst at Australia Strategic Policy Institute. Can the IT team prepare for Dr. Fitriani's slides? Hello, Fitri.
Hi, Belts. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone in Riyadh. In Canberra, it's 1 a.m., so apologies if I look pretty sleepy. Uh, Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be able to speak at the Internet Governance Forum 2024, and I would like to extend my gratitude to CSIS as well as Google for bringing this timely discussion on the issue that is essential, I think, for our digital feature and security. So my presentation today, if the IT team can manage to pull out the slide, is focusing on how we can tackle information manipulation in Southeast Asia by drawing lesson and what does not work in Australian experience. Um, if I can go to the next slide, I'll share in how disinformation and if we can go to the next slide, uh, disinformation and foreign information manipulation is a global challenge, and I think. As we know and has been discussing, it undermined democratic processes and exacerbate societal divides, weaken public trust in the institution. And I would argue here that Australia is similar to Southeast Asia, where threats are are happening in a fertile ground where the society is diverse in social, political, um, as well as opinion. And in Australia, for example, we're open to do protests on the street, and because of that, and we have many population that's coming from different parts of the world, and they are often leaving the country, but still have a connection from the country. And sometimes the government from the country actually conduct information operation to influence how they actually say good things about the country where they're from. If I can go to the presentation before the previous slide, I want to share about how this information is actually exploiting the sensitive issues of different political ideologies, and it is not common for state-sponsored actor to employ disinformation campaign aimed at fostering division, confusion, and mistrust among population. And for Australian experience, is to wage distrust against allies. It happened, for example, the example is where in the recent U.S. election, the recent BBC News was saying that Mr. Simon Nobokov. He's an Australian-born individual, but he was being known as the Russian spokesperson in Australia, and he was paying X account out of AlphaFox 78 $100 to post in AlphaFox Twitter account, X account, a fake AI video that falsely claimed Haitian immigrants engaging voting fraud in Georgia's swing state, and this actually posed a, a concern for Australia because such activities could tarnish Australia's reputation and connection to its allies. And it is implicating in a way that Australia can be considered as a launchpad for foreign interference in other countries. So this can be concerning, and I don't say that ASEAN country might be like this, but we can see it in a increasing geopolitical tension. That situation might happen in the future. Uh, Another example is how the disinformation, as Peter was sharing, has become more sophisticated and leveraging social platform. And the second example, the photo below, is from Southeast Asia, where there's actually
I think we're losing Fitri on Zoom. Fitri, are you still with us?
To go to
Oh,
bogus website channel and that have news that is produced by AI in a post that is unfounded, really fake, and they use a drone or flight that was being used for Ukraine in the example of South China Sea, and it actually trying to increase the tension by saying that U.S. is sending anti-tank missile to support the Philippines and so on, and actually they're copy pasting from ChatGPT, I think, because in the posting it actually said I am a language model AI and I cannot perform tasks that require real-time information. So but concerningly, this news on South China Sea was shared over, one of them was shared over 25 times. And I think we need to be aware of how this campaign is not only exacerbate regional tension but pose significant risks to the security and stability in Southeast Asia. And here in my presentation, I would like to share how Australian recent experience could provide valuable insight to addressing this challenge and perhaps give measure to combat information manipulation. So if we can go to the next slide, I will share of how Australia deal with information manipulation in the in last year Voice of Parliament, which is a referendum that called whether the First Nation, the Indigenous Aborigine people of Australia, can have a direct seat in the Parliament, like allocated seat. But this election, unlike the previously Russian operation in Australia, this was identified. There's allegedly linked with the Chinese Communist Party, and there's a lot of TikTok and social media, other social media being used to distribute false narrative that include racial segregation, and actually having the narrative, as you can read there, and say that it's a way to actually change how Australia currently is working. So how learning from the voice of Parliament failed to actually provide a stronger position for the First Nation people of Australia, then the government and the people are trying to address this challenge using three main ways. If I can go to the next slide, the three main ways is one, legislative effort, two is public and joint attribution, and three is fact-checking and awareness campaign. So let me start with the law, making the law. I know creating a law is a process that takes long, and I don't know whether the ASEAN 10 and will be perhaps with Timor-Leste joining hopefully soon. The countries of Southeast Asia can issue the update of law. But even in Australia, the proposed combating misinformation and disinformation bill was actually shut down by countries that are disagree by people that actually disagree and saying that perhaps this is just a way of trying to silence the people. So the disinformation and misinformation bill campaign is actually receiving disinformation campaign, and one of the senators that actually thanking Elon Musk is because Elon Musk actually shared this bill draft saying that Australia is creating this bill, and after Elon Musk tweeted it, it's the government received, and behind that there's another local parliamentarian that say like, if you want to disagree with this bill, this is how you do it. And after that, there's 16,000 submission saying how this bill should not go. So that bill was failed, although the effort should be appreciated. The second is having public and joint attribution. And for example, in the attribution might be difficult and cannot be done. For example, for countries that small and medium country that said, what's the benefit of saying that big country, major power, are conducting information operation to us, and we cannot respond to it. So the way Australia responds to the APT40 cyber threat activities is by actually calling other like-minded state that also become the victim of this advanced persistent threat 40 that infiltrating government computer system. So they call the government also call the U.S., U.K., Canada, New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan to issue a joint attribution. And this is called to a specific Chinese state-sponsored group. And the way it does it is not political attribution, but technical attribution. So maybe this is one of the way that can be done. And the third way is fact-checking and awareness campaign. And their government endorse and support, although the effort is done by independent institutions such as RMIT Fact Lab and Fact Checked AAP, that is systematically debunk false claim. I think other countries in Southeast Asia region have that, like such as Mafindo in Indonesia, and um, and uh, and Fairfile in Philippines, for example, that maybe Mario will share later. So if I can go to the next slide, how this is relevant for Southeast Asia, because in Southeast Asia also have diverse social political environment that present unique vulnerabilities to information manipulation. Um, I think Australia experiences similar with Southeast Asia. Uh, but the difference is there's fragmented regulation that hinders platform accountability. If I can give you example, the top right is one of the example how in several university journalism majors in Indonesia recently have signed an agreement MOU with Russia state media Sputnik to share how to do journalism. So it can be a bit concerning. And meanwhile, other countries in um, Southeast Asia, for example, Singapore actually implement sanction toward Russia. So there's a discrepancy of regulation addressed on a certain, as Peter is saying, actors that conduct information operation to the region, and this can be a concern, especially when there's limited public awareness that actually exacerbate susceptibility. So what happened in the region, I think, as well as in Australia, is that the government then is called to play a greater role in actually verifying what is fact and what is disinformation. The bottom example of the photo is where Singapore Law Minister Shanmugam, actually clarifying and saying how Israel diplomat are being insensitive of posting a comment on how many times the word Israel is actually mentioned in Quran. It's actually it's insensitive because that posting was shared in the height of Gaza conflict, but that how Singapore managed to control and the harmony of the country to not escalate the issue. So I call for the need of regional cooperation to counter shared threats, to actually communicate together, to share information of what happened in one country, and perhaps the content sharing agreement, for example, need to be something that the region need to talk to each other, because having content sharing agreement, for example, with Sputnik or with other countries, state media that might not be democratic or might not be correct in reporting the certain issue, might increase tension in the region unnecessarily. If I can go to the next slide, so on the recommendation of Southeast Asia, there's actually in terms of there's a diagram in terms of how what kind of content that can be addressed and regulate. First, the measurement is to address the one that leads most harms, and that would be equal with the level of intervention. There's 5 steps here that I suggest on how Southeast Asia can uh, address information operation or information influence. First is adopt clear regulation. So if there is a violation in certain social media platform, therefore, the if the government have established clear and enforceable regulation, then that violation can be brought to the criminal and justice law processes. So, for example, the regulation should include minimum content moderation standard that is published, for example, and mechanism of how to hold platform accountable. The second is having the strengthening of regional cooperation and intelligence sharing, as well as capacity of the government to address disinformation campaign. The third one is enhanced media literacy. Um, and ASEAN actually did this with trainers and under the education minister in countering disinformation. And we have module in ASEAN. What the next step is to actually translate that module to different ASEAN language. The, the third one is to promote the fourth one is, sorry, to promote transparency by encouraging platform to label trusted source. For example, to label whether this image is AI generated, whether the video is AI generated. The more difficult is perhaps the voice. How can we actually label voice to be AI generated? But maybe we can find a way. The last one is to build multi-stakeholder framework with civil society and the private sector, because somehow the technology that hosts the disinformation are owned by the private sector, and the civil society is the one that do mostly the checking, while the government is the one that supervise how the game is played. I think that's the end of my presentation. I thank you so much for the time given to me. I return to Bill
Thank you, Fitri.
as the moderator.
Thank you, Fitri. Uh, Perhaps 2 minutes elaborations uh, on what kind of lessons does Southeast Asian country can learn from the Australian experience in developing the code of conduct against misinformation and disinformation, and what kind of parallels that can Southeast Asian country adopt, whether unilaterally or through a regional organization.
I think good practical question. I think one that can be done is actually asking, for example, Google,
Yep.
as well as other other platform, actually rank uh, the website that is most credible to show first, like news from the government. And actually, what happened with the COVID time, there's a labeling, or this is new related to COVID-19. So that actually uh, would help the people to actually be more aware. If they can do that on COVID-19, I think they can do that for other things, like, for example, scam that actually quite prevalent, not only in Australia, uh, but also perhaps in Southeast Asia, because there's a lot of scam taking in on platform as well. And while the platform is actually showcasing, for example, job opportunities or advertisement discount or sale somewhere, they need to have this verification, the government disclaimer that please check, double check before you like input your details, for example. I think those two are the one that I recommend. Thank you.
Thank you, Fitri. Let's move on to Maria Elise from the Philippines, from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. You have 10 to 15 minutes, and please, the floor is yours.
Okay, hi. Good day, everyone, to Riyadh. Good evening from Manila. I'm sorry I also cannot join you physically, but I'm also pleased to be given this opportunity to join the panel. So I am Assistant Professor Maria Elise Mendoza from the Philippines, and I'm here to present the case of the Philippines in terms of addressing information manipulation. So I don't have slides, so I'll just be going through the suggested talking points. First is to provide an overview of the Philippines information landscape. So one thing that the Philippines has been known for many years is that we are the social media capital of the world, and we are also known as the patient zero of global disinformation, almost like the petri dish or the lab experiment of disinformation. So Filipinos are hyper connected to social media and are among the top internet users in the world, especially Facebook. So that's the top social media application being used in our country. Television, radio, and the internet are among the top three sources of people of information about politics and the government. But since the 2016 presidential campaign of former President Rodrigo Duterte, the country has seen an increase in the use of social media for political and electoral purposes. So the 2016 presidential elections marked a pivotal shift towards social media driven campaigning. So Duterte set the playbook for it. His victory was significantly influenced by coordinated digital campaigns on Facebook and YouTube, where content creators that we have come to know as social media influencers or bloggers have spread and amplified narratives supporting his policies, including the controversial and violent war against illegal drugs. So in the 2019 midterm elections, which wherein we vote for several national positions and local positions, the same playbook was adopted, and the opposition suffered an extreme blow in the Senate race. No opposition candidate won in the senatorial election. So all candidates allied with the Duterte administration won in the 2019 midterm elections. And in our next presidential elections, our most recent one, last 2022, the victory of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who is the son of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr., was also largely attributed to the spread of online disinformation across different social media platforms. And these contents spread on social media did not necessarily promote Marcos Jr. as a candidate, but rather they twisted historical narratives, attempted to to cleanse the family name of the Marcoses because they still have a lot to answer regarding the atrocities committed during the dictatorship. And it also contributed to the demonizing of the political opposition. So this information during Duterte's time also attempted to demonize the political opposition, and this continued until the 2022 presidential elections. Investigative reports from civil society groups and independent media outlets show that Marcos Jr. benefited the most from disinformation at the expense of the main opposition candidate, who is our former vice president. So at present, the Philippine information system is saturated with so-called independent media practitioners. These are technically the vloggers or the influencers who are not necessarily nor formally affiliated with any political party. What's interesting is that these vloggers and influencers who are followed and watched and heard by many Filipinos, millions of Filipinos, are not covered by existing media accreditation policies or the regulations surrounding journalists, for example. So they exert influence when it comes to shaping public opinion compared to official campaign teams of candidates because their online contents are extensively consumed by the general public. There is also evidence that they have been hired by politicians in previous elections, and that millions of pesos, which is around thousands of dollars or almost millions of dollars, have been spent to for these kinds of campaigns. And what's troubling is that the social media domain of these bloggers and influencers remains largely unregulated. So the contents are there. And add to that the poor content moderation policies of platforms such as Facebook and YouTube. These are aggravating the problem. So as a result of this saturation in the information ecosystem, a survey conducted in 2022 found that majority of Filipinos find it difficult to detect fake news. And similarly, despite the internet being a top source of information about politics and the government, the internet is also perceived as a top source of disinformation, mostly spread by influencers. So moreover, Filipinos have developed a growing distrust towards traditional media and journalists. And these findings, together with the fact that Filipinos are among the top social media users in the world, is a dangerous combination. So, how does foreign information manipulation and interference, or FIMI, enter the picture? So, we have had our share of FIMI in the past. FIMI, in the form of Chinese sponsored disinformation and propaganda, has been around during Duterte's time, who is relatively more friendly to China as compared to previous Philippine presidents. From 2018 to 2020, China launched a disinformation campaign known as Operation Naval Gazing, an attempt by China to penetrate the Philippine information space. So, what happened was that a network of fake accounts originating from China promoted and supported the Duterte family and Amy Marcos, who is the sister of the current president. So from 2018 to 2020, these fake accounts attacked the government critics, Duterte critics, including opposition senators and Philippine media. However, platforms such as Facebook have taken down some of these or pages and groups linked to China for coordinated inauthentic behavior. So in a nutshell, FIMI has not yet made impacts comparable to the domestic level of influence operations. A media outlet in the Philippines named SMNI is pro Duterte and pro China, but it was recently denied a legislative franchise to operate on television, so they are mostly operating on social media. So in the Philippines, disinformation and influence operations are mostly domestically created and spread by these social media influencers, bloggers, celebrities, digital workers, independent media practitioners, or even ordinary Filipinos who make a living out of creating and spreading disinformation or hyper partisan content online. The last part is actually interesting, the hyper partisan content, because not all contents are fake or false. Some are facts, but these were exaggerated and twisted to suit political agenda. But still, the threat of FIMI must not be disregarded because we've had a glimpse of it in the form of pro China content. One thing that we must also be wary of would be the potential use and misuse of generative AI in the upcoming elections. So, just very recently, a few months ago, our own president was a victim of this. An AI generated audio of him ordering an attack against China in light of the West Philippine Sea issue was spread and flagged by the government as false. So, given this, how has the Philippine government worked to address these challenges? Over the years, the Philippine government has failed to effectively address electoral disinformation. Three electoral cycles have passed since 2016, yet we are still facing a worsening problem, and we have an upcoming elections in 2025 this coming May. Legislative proposals to combat false information and regulate social media campaigns have not seen any progress. As a result, civil society actors, particularly media groups and academic institutions, have shouldered the responsibility of ensuring the integrity of facts by launching fact checking initiatives, digital literacy campaigns, voter education programs. However, without robust government support, a comprehensive legal framework, and systemic changes, the impact of these initiatives is limited. It was just last September 2024 when the country's election commission released a resolution that provided guidelines on the use of artificial intelligence and the punishment for the misuse of mis or for the use of disinformation in elections, just in time for the upcoming elections in 2025. This September 2024 resolution also establishes the COMELEC, or the Commission on Elections, formal collaboration networks with civil society actors. However, this is very late, and it remains to be seen whether it will be really implemented effectively given the extent of the problem that we have now. On the other hand, social media platforms such as Meta and TikTok have expressed their commitment to cooperate in the upcoming elections. This is badly needed because proactive content moderation measures and accountability must be demanded from and exercised by social media platforms. At present, contents that are obviously false and hyper-partisan, even if they were posted in the last electoral cycle, are still present in these platforms. They have not yet been taken down despite multiple reports. So this content moderation policies really have to be looked at. COMELEC must also, moving forward, COMELEC must also sustain and strengthen its engagements with civil society. Civil society actors alone cannot solve this problem, and they've been shouldering the burden of fighting against disinformation for the longest time. So this strong cooperation between the government and civil society is needed. Moreover, cybersecurity infrastructure in the country must also be strengthened. Outside of elections, Filipinos are highly susceptible to online scams, fraud, banking scams, and phishing attempts. So, multiple government websites have also been hacked recently. So, there were also instances of data breaches by government in government agencies where millions of data have been allegedly sold in the dark web. And lastly, to end my short presentation, in the long run, digital and media literacy must be fully incorporated in basic and higher education because at present, under the Philippine education system, only students in their last 2 years of high school have media literacy in their curriculum. The rest not really institutionalized. So this needs to be expanded across all levels of education to fully empower citizens in the fight against disinformation and information manipulation. So that's my short presentation on the case of the Philippines. I'm very much looking forward to the questions and the discussion later. Thank you very much
Thank you
for
so
having me.
much. Thank you so much, Maria. Again, another quick questions. I remember during COVID times there is an influence corporation allegedly done by Pentagon for the Philippines public to not to sow disbelief against Chinese issued vaccine, and then the Filipino public bought that idea and then they chose to wait for a more non-Chinese vaccine instead, and it creates little consequences to the Filipino public health during that time. So, would you say that in the realm of influence corporations, what is happening? Is it what happened in digital realm serves as an extension to geopolitical realities, particularly in Philippines' relations to the great powers?
Probably yes,
Hmm.
because some of in another forum that I attended, who wherein there were some analysts who looked at Philippine posts in China that are related to the Philippines. Some posts are actually discrediting the U.S. Philippines alliance, and at the same time, still supporting the Dutertes because Duterte is known as a president who is friendly to China, and Marcos Jr. is not exactly that. It is greatly perceived that Marcos Jr. is more leaning towards the United States. So there are posts being spread on Chinese social media wherein they are discrediting Marcos because he's pro-US, discrediting the Philippines-US alliance. So yeah, I think these kinds of disinformation can also be related to the geopolitical realities.
Thank you. So we've got the case study from Indonesia, from Australia, from Philippines. None of them seems to bear good news. So we rely on you, Dr. Big Chan, from Vietnam. How does the situation looks like in Vietnam?
Thank you, and I'm grateful for the opportunities to be here. Um, first I would like to give a brief description of Vietnam's information landscape. So there are three main components here. So the first one is domestic media and foreign media with Vietnamese language service and social media. So in terms of domestic media, most of them are state-owned or related to the government. So they are heavily regulated by the Communist Party of Vietnam. And they, of course, they adhere to official narrative. And in terms of foreign media with Vietnam language service, there are actually several of them, but I will give some examples from China and some Western medias. So for China, there are the China Global Television Network, or CGTN, and then the Pepugov Radio and TV. So both of them have Vietnamese language. And then for the Western media, from the UK, there is BBC, and then there's like US funded as well, like Voice of America or Radio Free Asia. The third one is social media. Unlike China, actually you can access a lot of Western platforms in Vietnam. Like according to several sources, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram actually among the tops of social media in Vietnam. And besides that, also there is a Vietnamese platform called Zalo. It's a messaging app like WhatsApp. And then also TikTok also very popular. So there is a kind of very many social media platforms that the Vietnamese can access and use. So in terms of foreign information manipulation and interference, so I will focus on the foreign interference part of this. So in Vietnam, because of its political system, so FIMI in election is actually not a big issue. The Vietnamese government is mostly concerned about China's disinformation about the South China Sea disputes and also what they called peaceful evolution from the West. So peaceful evolution is kind of defined as efforts by external forces seeking regime change without the use of militaries. Um, Let me try this. Okay. So with this, you know, sometimes, um, in terms of South China Sea issues, China has a lot of disinformation out there. But not related to FIMI, I would say that the first one is that sometimes they misquote Vietnamese leaders. For example, in 2016, only 2 days after the ruling of the arbitral tribunals regarding the case initiated by the Philippines against China, only 2 days then, the Vietnamese prime minister met the Chinese counterpart in Mongolia. And then after the event, a lot of Chinese media, newspapers, kind of reported that the Vietnamese prime minister actually said that Vietnam supported China's stance regarding the ruling. But actually he didn't say so. So the Vietnamese media immediately, because they got the permission from the government to kind of clarify on that. So they said that during the meetings, the Vietnamese Prime Minister mentioned things like the agreement in 2011 that Vietnam and China had regarding principles to settle the sea-related issues, and then things like the declaration on the code of conduct or the code of conduct itself and UNCLOS. And he never said anything about Vietnam supporting China's stand. So, with this kind of false information, it can, undermines the legitimacy of the Vietnamese Communist Party. So that's the concern here. And also, other China's narrative is to try to drive a wedge between Vietnam and Western partners by saying that, close relationship with external powers will not help Vietnam in the South China Sea disputes. And then in terms of peaceful evolutions, so for Vietnam, for the Vietnamese government, they perceived any kind of criticism on the Communist Party is peaceful evolution. So sometimes it can be like narrative, for example, the government is too weak in terms of response to China's behavior in the South China Sea, for example, try to undermine their legitimacy. Or sometimes, even the promotion of human rights or democracy can be seen as a peaceful evolution. And then other kind of narrative to try to advise Vietnam to, the Vietnamese people try to be, they should be anti-China or pro-US. So this kind of discourse can cause disunity in the society. And then sometimes, with the South China Sea disputes, there are some certain group kind of urge the people to stand up and to join the protest. So this is, with this, the Vietnamese government is concerned about, from the protest against China, it could, lead to some other issues as well and cause instabilities in the society. So here I just want to emphasize that, between disinformation and FIMI, there is actually a very thin line that we can walk here. So they are related, but they are two different concepts. And in the case of Vietnam, sometimes, the perceived FIMI can be also quite significant because for the government and for the Communist Party of Vietnam, they have their concerns as well. So, so for that, I think it's very difficult for them to strike the balance between political stability and freedom of speech sometimes. So in terms of action on how the Vietnamese government has done to deal with FIMI, so I focus on the on the government part because there are not much from the civil society itself. So for the government, they repeatedly rebuffed China's full narrative on the South China Sea, either through the spokespersons of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or through state-owned media. So they try to do that every time they discovered any disinformation from China. And to deal with peaceful evolution in 2016, the Vietnamese Ministry of Defense created what they call Task Force 47 to counter wrong view on the internet. And after that, in 2017, only 1 year later, they created a cyber command. It's interesting because, compared to some other cyber commands, then the Vietnamese one actually also in charge of countering peaceful evolution. Yeah. So I will end here and hope to open to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Big. Before we get on to the discussion part of the session, one little question for you. You mentioned something about the balance between regulation and also freedom of expression, but I believe that's not the only balance that the government is also facing, because there is also this balance of countering information manipulation while also the dependence or interdependence economically to a certain actor. So how does the Vietnamese government balance between this dependence and also combating the foreign interference? Yeah, yeah,
Oh, it's not.
yeah, it's not working.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So, I forgot to mention that for, to deal with FIMI, actually in Vietnam, people can still access the Chinese media, the Chinese newspapers with Vietnamese language service, but they cannot access, other media, for example, BBC or Voice of America. So I think for the Vietnamese government, because they know that, I think it's it speaks to what Peter and Fishy already mentioned, that I think for the government, they know that no matter what the Chinese say about the South China Sea, the Vietnamese people will not believe. Yeah, so they're not too concerned about Chinese media. But for the Western one, it's a different issue because in Vietnam it's a one-state party, so I think they are a little more sensitive in that area. And back to your question about some kind of dependence on like economic issues with some partners. I think that could be one of the reasons as well. But I believe that what I mentioned earlier is the main reason why, because for Chinese media, there's not much worry.
Okay, thank you. So I believe we have at least time for 3 questions. So for anyone that wants to raise question, please make yourself identifiable, uh, and then our staff will come to you. Yeah,
Sorry.
that's right.
So, hello. Thank you for your presentations. It was very insightful. My name is Luisa. I'm an advisor for the German-Brazilian Digital Dialogue, an initiative to promote digital transformation, and we also address disinformation as a topic.
Okay.
So, I haven't had many contact with the Southeast context so far, so I wanted to ask you if you have any cases of disinformation having effects on the physical world, so to say, because like in Brazil we had the attack to the Supreme Court, and also in South Africa I know there has been some complications with the Electoral Commission and etc. So are there any records of this in Southeast countries as well from Asia? Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. So that's one question on on the impact of disinformation to real life incidents. Shall we gather two more questions, please, sir? Um, and then the lady in the back. Uh, yeah.
Uh, uh, okay. Thank you. My name is Koichiro from Japan. I'm a cybersecurity expert, and I have few questions. First of all, um, was the Fitriani's presentation, I feel it is contradictory because on one hand, we need to expect platformers to do more in this regard. And at the same time, countries like Australia, United States, and others, we already decide to ban certain online platformers from from a market. So I like to ask, any panelists for their view on which is better. Expect more for performers or, ban them from your own economy. Of course, some of this initiative is funded by one of giant performer.
Yep.
So how you can trust one performer to, how you can say one performer is trustworthy than others. My last question is, there's a movement to revitalize the discussion at the ASEAN Regional Forum. I was wondering, while listening to you, all the presentation, I was wondering which is the best platform to discuss, our step forward in FIMI and disinformation. Since as a regional forum, we have China, Russia, and others. Of course, IGF might be the decent platform as well, but I also like to ask panelists where we should go for our next round of discussion. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Koichiro-san. And last question for this term, please.
Yeah, hi, my name is Nidhi. And I have a question. When it comes to dealing with misinformation, I think that we've all discussed how you can have digital literacy campaigns and maybe something along those lines, some technical solutions. But as you talked about, a large part of, I think, misinformation comes from confirmation bias. And also, I think there is something to be considered that the people who are in most power actually tend to have a greater role in spreading it. So even if you did manage to achieve digital literacy, which I think there are a lot of technical solutions for, this is a larger sociological problem at this point, where if you're getting views for it or if you're getting power out of it, there's no reason for anybody to stop sort of putting out disinformation, and even if you know it's wrong, from believing it. So unless you have some way of sort of tackling that larger sociological problem on what has become alternative truth, it won't really matter so much what technical solutions you come up with. But I'm not so sure how you would go around doing that, because nobody has incentive to do that right now.
Thank you for the intervention. Let's go on with the three questions first before we go open another sessions. So the first question from Lisa, whether disinformation ever transform into real-life incidents in Southeast Asia, from Koichiro-san. So specifically to P3, which one is better? Should platform do more, or should we ban them entirely? And also a question to the general speakers, what will be the best platform regionally to discuss this issue further, whether it is a multilateral platform such as Asian Regional Forum or a multi-stakeholder forum such as such as APR IGF, for example. And some remarks from Randy on no matter how technical solution is available to address this session, there's these key opinion leaders that can breathe through and confirms to the confirmation bias of the audience. So whether there is a means for us to curb or to curb the influence of these people in power, whether it is through whether in government or in tech platform. Please, Peter, you want to go first?
Sure. I think for the first one,
Yeah.
Cases of disinformation affecting the physical world, I think the case that we discussed earlier on the U.S.'s influence operations in the Philippines, that was actually declassified by the Pentagon, and posted again by Reuters, a Reuters investigation. So the influence operation was more or less them trying to sow disconfidence against the Chinese-made vaccines in the Philippines, which resulted in people not taking the vaccine and waiting for Western options. So I think that's a really big example of a foreign entity outside of Southeast Asia creating an influence operation that had real-life physical effects, and I'm sure there are others as well. But I think that's off the top of my head. That's a big one that we could reference. Um, and then to the question from Koichiro-san about best platform to discuss FEMI in the Asia Pacific, I think the conversation shouldn't start at where the best platform is. I think we should take the discussion a little back towards whether or not countries in Southeast Asia or the Asia Pacific have the same threat perceptions towards FEMI and whether or not that's the case. Because I think I can speak from a Southeast Asian perspective where I don't think everyone is on the same page as far as FEMI. I've said before that ASEAN has a cybersecurity cooperation strategy and a lot of different cyber initiatives, but they mostly focus on cybercrime, so financial scams, deepfakes and financial fraud, and so on and so forth. ASEAN is already working with Interpol. We have a cybercrime operations desk. I think those initiatives are probably the low-hanging fruit as far as Southeast Asia-wise. But I think FEMI, especially in the Asia Pacific, where you have some victims and you have some threat actors, government and non-state, I think the conversation shouldn't start at which platform is best, and getting everyone on the same page first, I think is the real challenge, because everyone has different threat perceptions and addressing how they want with FEMI. And for the intervention from a colleague about confirmation bias and a broader socio-psychological problem with disinformation, I fully agree with your statement, and I think it's why Fitri and I and other Bic and Maria is sort of proposing for this research to take on a more multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary approach, because I think most of us in this panel are sort of IR or cybersecurity specialists, and I think involving people from different lines of academia or others as well, I think would be a good step forward in understanding the problem a bit broadly. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Big, you want to do next?
I would like to add on what Peter said, regarding to Nidhi's question. Yes, so even though, like certain bias make, the readers have more appetite for disinformation, for example, but I still believe that digital literacy campaigns will help, because especially for those who hasn't formed their opinion yet, then, the skills to identify trusted sources will serve them in a lot of issues.
Thank you. Fitri, specific question on platforms.
Thank you. In Australia, we have Australian Communication and Media Authority, ACMA, voluntary code that actually call for platform digital media to develop and report on safeguard to prevent harm that may arise from the propagation of mis and disinformation on their services. So it's a voluntary code, but there's a concern of how about if the code does not work, as especially we know there's a certain platform that after some rich people buy that platform, that platform is being used for disinformation. And that's why in Australia there's a call for the bill, disinformation and misinformation bill that failed to be tabled. It's shut down. So whether we call to regulate the platform or just do away with it, I think it's good to have a voluntary code. It's very mature, and if we kind of expect the platform have goodwill in doing their business, they need to be able to show that they can prevent harm. But we know there are platform like Telegrams that actually very rarely responds to the government call when there's like information of like terrorism and whatnot. That is quite concerning. So perhaps we can do both sides. We can allow the voluntary code to let platform to um, to safeguard themselves, and as well when that doesn't work, the government need to have tool to actually intervene. So that's one. And for me, I want to, if I may, answer how can we discuss in the regional platform? I think in ASEAN, we have the ASEAN Task Force countering fake news, and that task force actually managed to issue the guideline on how the government can manage and combat fake news. It is the task force only issued last year, established last year, and the guidelines also just recent. So I think if ASEAN can do it, I encourage other region perhaps able to do it, because that guidelines is actually telling what the government 10 ways, for example, what the government do when there's fake news detected. So that's my insight. My suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Fitri. Maria, you want to respond to any of the question?
Oh, okay. So hi, the transformation of disinformation or the effects of disinformation on the physical world, the vaccine example is a good one. And aside from the campaign against Chinese vaccines, disinformation surrounding the side effects of vaccines in general have also made physical effects here in the Philippines, because there has been a high level of vaccine hesitancy in the past years because of another vaccine before COVID. So that's one, and also probably the lies that the Marcos family spread about themselves were actually being cited by their supporters as their reasons for voting for them, especially when they attend campaign rallies and are interviewed why they vote for the Marcoses. So I think that's also an effect of disinformation on the physical world, that people actually wholeheartedly believe these lies spread on social media. And regarding the confirmation bias, I think the question of confirmation bias, an additional insight that I can provide would be tech platforms would still have a responsibility regarding this issue because of how they control the algorithm. So we know that if we react to the same kinds of posts or comment on the same kinds of posts, these posts will keep appearing on our feeds. So if hyper partisan contents keep appearing on our feeds due to the algorithm, then it worsens the problem. So with that, tech platforms also have a responsibility with regards to the transparency of the algorithm, probably, or controlling the algorithm in general, because Facebook, for instance, has been under fire for allegedly prioritizing posts that have more angry reactions. So those that are really emotionally charged get more exposure on people's news feeds, and in that way, they also contribute to the problem. So still, even if it's a sociological issue, Peter is correct. A multi-sectoral approach involving digital platforms of society would still be an important step in terms of solving this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. One or two more questions before we close the session. Okay, the lady in the back.
Hi, my name is Eliza from Vietnam but working in Germany. And my questions is actually addressed to the first speaker, but I welcome responses and contributions from other speakers as well. So in your research, how would you define FIMI? Do you include people from the diasporic communities as perpetrators of disinformation? And in your research, in your findings, you mentioned that there are state and non-state actors. Can you please give us an example of non-state actors? And in your research, did you also find evidence of the participation of the Islamic State in spreading disinformation in the case of Indonesia? And I just want to add one kind of like input to the question of Lisa. Actually, when you ask about online disinformation and the real life, incidents and court, I must emphasize in the case of Vietnam, only the government can decide what is disinformation or not. In the case of one party in Vietnam, one party state in Vietnam, we have the legislative, executive, and judiciary powers belonging to the state, which means the head of all these state agencies must be the Communist Party members. And so when they say that is disinformation, they have the power to punish. So I would say that on a monthly basis, there are cases where online disinformation, whether it's just a small post critical of a state-backed company or just one small video mimicking a state leader, can be punished. And the highest punishment in the case of Vietnam is 20 years of imprisonment. So I would say that disinformation in Vietnam is very hard to detect. Oh, sorry, I forgot one question to Filtry. How do you see the political will of ASEAN in fighting disinformation spread and created by the government? So you talked about ASEAN fighting disinformation in general. How about the disinformation spread deliberately by the governments? Thank you.
Thank you. And one last question from the gentleman in the back. Preferably a quick question.
Thank you so much. I'm Fawaz from Center for Communication Governance, New Delhi. We've been having very similar conversations. It was very interesting, very useful to join this. We also had a general election this year. And one problem that I think across the board we are facing that the last question also spoke to is the discourse around disinformation, misinformation has also now become weaponized, where fact-checking or countering disinformation, often these narratives are appropriated by the people, who sometimes might be causing real-world harm. So this is just a short intervention to say we are seeing very real-world harm linked to online disinformation. At the same time, the lack of the kind of multi-stakeholder research that we've been talking about is leading, it's making possible this kind of appropriation. So yeah, just a short intervention to say we really do need not just multi-stakeholder, but also maybe inter-regional cooperation to bring out how disinformation is happening, how it's related to online events, and also how the discourse is being misappropriated. Thank you.
Thank you, Fawaz. I think the parallel between Fawaz and Elite's intervention is who is the arbiter of truth? Like, in which power should we endow the government or the civil society or tech platform to be the arbiter of truth, and what kind of multi-stakeholder, multilateral cooperation can be done to that. Last response from each of the speakers regarding these two interventions. You can go first. Yeah.
Okay. Hello? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Great. So addressing the question about defining FEMI. So the way we've defined FEMI is with pattern of mostly manipulative information that threatens or has the potential to negatively impact values, procedures, and political processes in a country conducted by a foreign state or non-state actor and their proxies. Still, I think while we've conducted this research, we've also conducted a focus group discussion with various experts from both Southeast Asia and external countries. And what we found through those discussions is that FEMI is still a very, very hard thing to define. Even, FEMI was first coined by the European Union External Action Service, and that's where we drew the first definition. But I think another step forward that we can take is sort of taking a more maybe Southeast Asian or Asia-Pacific specific definition for FEMI. And I think that's one of the research direction that we could take, is finding a definition for FEMI that is context-specific and more palatable, I would say, or more applicable to different information landscapes. So I understand that it is a very difficult thing to define. And another question I think was about the role of the Islamic State in information operations in Indonesia. Our time period for research was 2019 to 2024. And I think from the top of my head, while we're still early in the data set and we're still adding cases to it, I don't think we've found cases of Islamic State perpetuating influence operations in Indonesia, although I would say with a disclaimer that this is still very early on in the data set and we could find cases later on that were reported. But so far, I don't think we found any. And I think an explanation for that, it could be because I think terrorism cases in Indonesia, I'm not a terrorism studies expert, but I think broadly speaking, terrorism and terrorist groups in Indonesia have taken a downturn in activity in recent years. I could be very, very wrong in that regard, but that is, I think, a broad assumption that I could make as to why that has not occurred.
Thank you. Vic, you want to add to that?
So just want to, say something about your question actually about like who should we, give the power to be arbiter of truth. So, because in the discussion we mentioned about, the digital literacy campaigns. So, I think, if we make it like mandatory to be taught in school, it will reach more people, of course. But then who textbook would we use, right? So what kind of curriculums and the definition? So that's actually the very big issue that we.
There you go. Okay. Okay. Fitri and Maria, quick response.
Thank you. Difficult question. The the textbook that the guidance, the ASEAN guideline on management of government information in combating fake news and information in media is actually strategically saying that this is the perspective and stand of the ASEAN government. But interestingly, there's a chapter there if you want to take a look of it. There's type of how government address disinformation. So there's whole of government approach and there's strategic government approach or combination. The whole government approach is having a different agency, civil society as well. But the strategic government approach, as you know, how we know this government side of things as as Baltazar mentioned is the one that decide what's the truth and what the people can listen to. And I think ASEAN embraced that and it's aware of that. But having this, you know, being aware of it and having multiple ways of approaching the issue would actually not alienate countries that actually non-democratic in a way, but also struggling with disinformation on or for information coming from abroad. So that trying to separate or wedge ASEAN countries against each other. So that's why the ASEAN is actually trying to address this information.
Thank you.
I hope it
Maria,
answers.
one last remark.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just like to agree with the last intervention regarding cooperation within the region, whether it's in Southeast Asia or the Indo-Pacific, because as in the case of the Philippines, we really have a lot to catch up on in terms of addressing this information. And as I keep mentioning in my presentation, there are no clear legislative frameworks at present to address this problem, but we also have to be very careful with passing legislation that might infringe on freedom of speech, because as far as I know, there are some countries with anti-fake news laws, but these are being weaponized by the current government, that anything that is dissent equals fake news. So we must be careful regarding that. So we really have a lot to learn from our neighbors in Southeast Asia, in the greater Indo-Pacific region, in terms of addressing this problem. So I do agree that regional cooperation is important, and I think a single country like us engaging with tech platforms, calling them to be more accountable, might have less effect as compared to when multiple countries come together and really demand action from these tech platforms. That latter strategy might be more effective for them to really be able to address this problem. So that's it from my end. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Um, Thank you all to all the speakers and for the participants for engaging in the discussion. I will not conclude because simply one, there is not much time, and second, the only concluding remarks that I can deliver is we have no option to isolate this information issue solely as an information issue, because when it becomes an electoral issue, then we have to answer it through an electoral means. When it becomes an economic and trade issues, we also need to consider the participation of economic trade actors, so for as and so on and so forth. So the discussion needs to continue beyond this room and also beyond the region of Southeast Asia. So please feel free to drop by to our booth whenever you have the time to learn more about our works and potentially cooperate for the next research. Thank you very much for your participation. Please join me in giving the round of applause to the speakers, and best of luck for your IGF participation. Goodbye.